Welcome back to the School Muscle. On today's episode, we have Dr. Jose Antonio. He's a really great protein researcher. We discuss his recent studies, practical implications for athletes, higher protein intakes, and we discuss the FTO gene, a gene related to obesity and body composition and things like that. And we have a really fantastic discussion. So without further ado, Dr. Jose Antonio. So in 2014, you kind of did a study on protein overfeeding and had one group consuming nearly like 4.4 grams per kilo. So could you kind of take us through like the methods and kind of what you found with that study?
Yeah, the initial impetus for that study was really conversations I had with a lot of bodybuilders in terms of, how much protein do you actually eat a day, how you train and things like that. And I realized that no one has actually done or had actually done a study on bodybuilders consuming a high protein diet just to see what extra protein would do without actually changing training, because I wanted to just see just that one variable, what would happen. And so, we decided if we're going to go high, let's go really high. I mean, some people say, well, if you're over 1 gram per pound or 2.2 grams per kilo, that's pretty high. But, let's double it. Let's go to 2 grams per pound, or in this case, 4 grams per kilo, over 4 grams per kilo, actually. And honestly, we didn't know what would happen. I think what's interesting is that we found that nothing happened, which is kind of interesting when you get trained guys and girls, they're already working out. The idea that you don't change training, but just eat more food. In this case, it was actually whey protein. It wasn't like they were eating more chicken or beef. They were actually just consuming more whey. They didn't gain any fat. They didn't gain any muscle. So that told us right there that, one, it's very difficult to get fat eating protein, even if you're eating in what would be considered a caloric surplus or what above and beyond what they're normally eating. It's just really difficult to get fat. So that was probably one of the more surprising things. And the response from so many people who were in social media was like, that's not even possible. How can you eat more protein, eat more calories, and actually lose body fat? And I mean, without a change in body fat. And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, we do the study, we measure the subjects, we get the data, and the data is the data. It's not like I can't tell the bod pod what to do. And at the time, we were using the bod pod to measure percent fat. So that's what we found. It was really kind of interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I think it kind of dispels the notion that a calorie is just a calorie. And I think that's really interesting. And, for the high protein group, I just jotted down some notes, and I had that they eat like on average about 860 calories more than the control group. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, when we crunch the numbers, and clearly, as you know, the way people record diet, it's not completely accurate. But then again, it's not completely accurate on both sides, whether it's the high protein group or the control group. So you have that issue. But yeah, the 800 calorie difference actually was what we measured. And, people are scratching their heads. Well, how can you consume 800 more calories, even if it is protein, and not gain any fat or gain any weight? And I think, we sort of came to the conclusion that, one, we know protein has a high thermic effect. So you're going to burn calories just from eating protein. The other thing, and this is more speculative, is that maybe all that protein somehow affects NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And we haven't measured that, so it's purely speculative, but in a way it makes sense. And because you can't store protein, you have to probably utilize it as fuel. It's not like carbs and fat, where you eat excess of carbs and fat, your body has a nice, easy way to store it. You can't store protein.
Right. So you might have that increase in NEAT a little bit. And is there any other maybe potentially physiological, maybe more mechanistic reasons for why someone might not increase body fat when overeating on protein?
Well, the other possible explanation had to do with maybe the people who are on the high protein diet may have overestimated their consumption. And so their appetite was actually suppressed, and they actually ended up eating less than they recorded, which is kind of odd, because typically with diet logs, if you look at enough of them, and I've looked at hundreds of these, rarely does anyone overestimate. Almost everybody underestimates food intake. No one ever says, you know what, I don't know if I had 2 or 3 chicken breasts, so I think I'll put 4. Normally It's like, did I have 2 or 3 chicken breasts? I think I'll put 1.5. I mean, people are notorious for that. And in our studies, in general, women tend to underestimate it more than men, it just seems, because when you see how much they're eating, I'm like, there's no way you're eating that little for the amount of exercise you do and for the amount of muscle you carry. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right. And do you think that a potential, I've seen criticism of some of these higher protein diets that, well, it's hard to really know if they're eating that much protein or if they're kind of just going with what the researchers are, if they want to like do the right thing by the researchers by saying they're having this protein and then not eating it. So what would you kind of say to that?
Well, and this is where whenever you do a study, one of the most critical things, and it's almost overlooked by people who don't do research, is subject recruitment. You have to find subjects, one that I only work with trained people. So I get all the subjects I do for my studies. They all love to lift or they all love to run. Whatever training they do, they love to train. The other thing is most people volunteer for these studies because they love to consume protein. And what's interesting is people say, well, how do you know it's accurate in terms of how much protein that they logged in in terms of their diet? And we actually made it easy such that the only extra protein they're getting are from shakes. So it's not like they're eating more fish or more chicken or beef. It's basically have 2 or 3 extra shakes a day, and you know exactly what you're getting because you're the one scooping. You know, each scoop is 25 grams. So you do 3 scoops, that's 75 grams. It should be pretty close to what they actually are doing. So in that case, it's not like they're adding extra like animal products. You know, whether it's beef, chicken, or fish. It's just shakes. So, and that's easy to measure.
Right. And does the study kind of provide this whey protein powder for them as well? Or how's that kind of work on that end of thing? Okay. So it's not like it's costing them a bunch more money to eat this protein.
Right. And in fact, that's a lot of my subjects volunteer precisely because they're like, wow, I don't have to buy my own protein. Okay. I'm in your study because in their eyes, they're like, I'm going to eat protein anyways, but in this case, I'm going to eat more of it, which is fine. So they, for whatever 8, 12 weeks or however many weeks we do it, they basically don't have to buy any whey protein, which is kind of nice for them.
Yeah, for sure. I think that would sound like a good setup for me anyways. So
exactly. See, if you were in South Florida, you could be in one of my studies.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm in Iowa right now, and today we had a high of negative 20. So that was fun.
Wow, where in Iowa are you?
I'm in eastern Iowa, so Cedar Falls, Iowa. That's University of Northern Iowa is where I'm from.
Ah, okay. Actually, I have a nephew to go there. In fact, my daughter goes to Wartburg College.
Oh, no way. I actually I visited Wartburg and thought about going to Wartburg. So that's really cool.
Oh my God. That's, wow. That's amazing. Yeah. She's freezing her butt off there. It's like, oh my God. I think there was a couple days it was like minus 51 or something crazy. I'm like, my God, it's literally over a 100-degree difference between Iowa and Florida. I'm like, oh my, 100-degree difference. That's crazy.
It's ridiculous. I think the other day we had like a wind chill of like negative 50, like you said. And then this weekend it's supposed to be like 50 degrees. So we're having like 100-degree difference, but we're still only getting up to 50 degrees. So
right. But that'll feel tropical.
Oh, that'll feel like t-shirt weather for sure.
Wow, that's crazy. Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, it is ridiculous. And something that I kind of thought was interesting in your study was that whey protein has a greater thermic effect than casein. I wasn't really aware of that. Is that sound about right? There aren't many head-to-head studies looking at whey versus casein in terms of thermic effect. And I think mainly because if there's a difference in thermic effect, it's probably not enough to matter. This was a long time ago. It might have been 6 years ago, looking at the thermic effect of whey, and we found that it went as high as 40%, which is actually really high. Yeah.
But, I doubt there's that big enough difference between whey and casein where consuming whey over casein would matter in the long run. But those two are probably the most intriguing proteins precisely because the rate of digestion and absorption between whey and casein is so different that I've always tell people, probably your best bet is actually to combine the two. But I think people like the taste and the mouthfeel of whey protein over casein. People say casein's too thick. I mean, it's hard to drink. And I'm like, yeah, I guess it is. And I think that's why everyone loves whey protein.
Yeah, I think it might be a little bit more difficult in your studies if it was just that thick casein that they had to drink every day. So.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and that's true. In fact, I had subjects who initially wanted casein, and they realized that there's a difference between having one casein shake a day and having 4.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
okay, now I'm drinking syrup, it's so thick.
For sure. And kind of after this study, you did a 2015 study, and it was in, they were following a more periodized program. So it kind of seemed like you controlled for the training part of it. So would you like to kind of take us through what you found with that study?
Yeah, because in the first study, we didn't change training. We just said, eat a lot of protein. Let's see what happens. So we found that nothing happened. So, sports scientists always look at the combination of, training plus nutrition. So what happens if we change the way they train? And so in essence, we're providing two new stimuli. One is the new training program. The other is higher protein. But in this case, we dropped the protein intake to about 3 grams per kilo versus over 4 grams per kilo, because we found that, God, in that first study, we had a lot of people drop out. They basically said, I can't eat this, I can't drink this many shakes, and I can't possibly eat this much protein if it was from foods like chicken or beef. So they dropped out. They're like, they literally couldn't do it. And people are like, wow, it's that hard to eat a lot? And it's like, believe it or not, it is hard to eat a lot. So we decided, okay, to keep people from dropping out, let's drop the protein dose to 3 grams per kilo and then implement, a traditional split routine bodybuilding type program. And we actually found something interesting. So we have 2 groups. One group was about 2.2 grams per kilo, roughly. The other group was over 3 grams per kilo. They both gained the same amount of lean body mass. It was almost actually identical, which is kind of weird. But the amount of fat mass they lost was much greater in the high protein group versus, and I don't even want to say low protein group, because even the lower group was considered high. So
right, I think it was around like 165 grams or something like that. So
right. So it's sort of like we compared high to really high, and we found that the really high, they lost body fat. But again, we also changed their training. So there's something about eating the high protein diet and altering the way you train that may confer an effect in terms of losing fat mass. However, there seems to be a limit in terms of, if the goal is to gain lean body mass, there seems to be an upper limit where anything more than 2.2, 2.3 grams per kilo, maybe you don't need. But again, the flip side of that is you might lose body fat if you increase the intake.
Really interesting. And did the group that ate a higher protein diet, did they also eat more calories and still see this decrease in body fat as well?
Yeah, in fact, they ate more calories, but it wasn't like the first study. I think they ate roughly 400 more calories a day. So still a lot of calories, but it's not like they're eating donuts. But yeah, they lost body fat, and it sort of harkens back to the calorie in, calorie out conundrum, or these debates that you see frequently, misses the fact that when you intake protein, it also affects calorie output. It's not like putting money in the bank. You put money in the bank, interest grows. In fact, you almost could think of protein as not the best source of, if the goal is to store energy, like evolutionarily, we want to store energy in case there's a famine or you freeze your butt off in Iowa or something, So imagine you can't go to the grocery store for a month, so you got to live off your fat. Yep. Protein's not a good way to do that because you have to oxidize whatever excess you consume. So, in a way, evolutionarily, it makes sense that it's hard to either gain fat and it might be easier to lose fat if all you're doing is adding extra protein.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's just crazy to me to think that group had like 400 more total calories, and all this time we've been hearing, if you overeat your calories, you're going to gain body fat. And this group actually lost body fat. So that's crazy to me.
Yeah. And in fact, we're not the only lab that's done this. There's a lab, Dr. Bill Campbell, University of South Florida. I think he's done similar work where, the added protein actually helps you lose fat, despite the fact that calories might be more. So, I think we're starting to look particularly at protein as the primary nutrient or macronutrient that drives fat loss. If the goal is to lose body fat, that might be really the primary nutrient.
Yeah, I think that based on these studies, that definitely sounds like a reasonable conclusion to be had. And then kind of after this study, you kind of moved on to a 2016 study, and it seems like kind of the difference here was this was in like more trained individuals. And does that sound about right?
Yeah, in fact, when you go through studies, typically you go through these steps where you do one study, it generates a new set of questions. You go to the second study, it generates a new set of questions. And then this one was, okay, why don't we get the most highly trained guys from that second study? And these are all male bodybuilders. And sort of as a sidebar, I want to say that our best subjects in terms of recording what they train, recording what they eat, have always been bodybuilders. Why? Because that's what they do. I mean, they're always very, very meticulous about what they eat because it's just part of the sport. So we got the most highly trained male bodybuilders, and we basically asked them to maintain a higher protein diet for 1 year. We initially started with 16 weeks, and then we carried it over to a year. And the primary purpose of that wasn't to see really body composition, because if you follow athletes over the course of a year, what you'll notice is that body composition tends to go up and down, and it tends to mimic the diet and training program of the time. And obviously, over a course of a year, it's going to change a lot. But what we wanted to find was, if you're consuming a high protein diet, how does it affect health? How does it affect kidney function, liver function, and things like that? And what do you know? We found it does nothing. I mean, of course, I sort of known this for 30 years. I think people in the bodybuilding world knew it for 30 years. Clinical nutritionists apparently don't know this, and they keep telling people it's bad for your kidneys. But after 1 year, nothing. There was no harm to renal function at all. So I mean, that might be might be the only study actually in trained people eating a high protein diet looking at renal function. So.
Cool. So the main finding from that study was more so along the lines of it's probably a pretty healthy practice rather than like any particular body composition changes and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's definitely that. And we actually did a 2-year follow-up. So we got of that group, I think half of them said, okay, well, you could follow me up for another year. So it'll be a total of 2 years. And again, 2 years, we didn't find anything. There was no harm to anything. And what's interesting is one of our more intriguing subjects, he consumes about 5 grams per kilo.
Wow.
And that's his normal intake. In fact, if he drops to 4, he's like, bro, this is too low. I need more protein. Yeah, it's like, holy crap, I don't know how you eat that much. So 5 grams per kilo, he's been doing this for years. And nothing. Everything's fine. I mean, and people say, well, how do you know things don't change in 20 years? And the answer to that is, well, I guess I don't know, because I don't know any human beings that consume 5 grams per kilo other than him. So, I mean, right. I guess we'll find out in 20 years. But for the people who consume, let's say 2 to 3 grams per kilo, I'm like, yeah, they're fine. I mean, that's basically getting a couple extra shakes or eating a couple extra chicken breasts or a big steak. I mean, people think it's just a lot of protein, but in fact, it's not as much as you think. I mean, it's just that here's the thing. I always tell, if you're full after eating, it's always easy to have dessert because it's carbs and fat. Then, hey, could I have another piece of steak? For whatever reason, we love carbs and fat, whether or not we're full. But eating more protein when you're full, it's like, oh, I don't think I can eat anymore. So our brain loves to get carbs and fat.
Right, for sure. And I think that you make a really good point to where it's actually pretty easy if you just triple up a few scoops of whey protein and throw that into one single shake. You can knock that out in just a minute. So I don't think it's ridiculous to have these higher protein intakes.
Yeah. And in fact, once you do that, you get a 50 to 75 gram shake. Basically getting the rest of your protein is you can almost eat just your normal meals and not even worry about it. Now, the flip side of that, a lot of people will say, if I consume that much protein in a single sitting, oftentimes they're just not hungry. So, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's a legitimate point. You might not be hungry, but, it's give it a shot, and you'll find that, sometimes eating is as important as training, and you almost have to train eating, particularly if you're a competitive athlete. That's just what you do. It's sort of like you get up, you lift weights, you do sprints, whatever. You do skill work for whatever sport you are, and you just got to eat correctly. And, that's something, you just got to do.
Yep, for sure. And I know I've heard before that some professional bodybuilders, the things that make the best ones are the ones that can actually gain weight on less calories, and they can actually eat a lot of calories. So I think that eating component is definitely really important there for sure. Yeah,
if you could get by on eating less calories, hell, that's much better, because now you don't have to spend money, time and effort in eating. I mean, a lot of these guys literally just get sick of eating. They're like, I just don't want to eat. And so, it becomes work. And when it becomes work, it's no longer fun.
Yep. And that's on the flip side of this. That's why I think a higher protein diet could potentially be beneficial during like a dieting phase when hunger might be a little bit higher. Keeping this higher protein intake might help a lot of people.
True. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, I agree. Yep.
And is there any other like practical recommendations you might give to people in regards to like these higher protein intakes, some take home on protein?
Yeah. Well, before I get to that, I do want to mention people that ask, well, what happens to trained women who on a high protein diet? Does it affect their bones? And we actually just finished and published a study on trained women. These a lot of these girls were competitive college athletes. Some were recreational bodybuilders, but they consumed not as much as the guys, but they were consuming about 2.3 grams per kilo over 1 year. And we found that their bone mineral density was fine. Nothing changed. Their lumbar spine, which we measured specifically, no change in bone mineral content. So to me, there are two myths associated with protein. One is a lot of protein is bad for your kidneys. The other one is too much protein will leach your bones of calcium and you'll demineralize your bones. And both are just completely made up. It's total fabrications. And so I just want to mention that because a lot of people are worried about, whether protein is bad for your bones. So in terms of practical recommendations, I think you have to look at the particular goal of the athlete. And I'll deal with sports first before I get to bodybuilding. If you're dealing with classic endurance sports versus the strength power sports. So endurance sports like running a 10,000 meter up to a marathon, the power sports would be the 100-meter dash, pole vault, triple jump, long jump, the pure speed power sports. That calories are probably a bigger issue with the endurance group. Why? Because they're just expending more energy. So as a percentage of diet, you will find probably that protein plays a lower percentage of the diet with endurance athletes, but it's only because they're just eating more stuff. However, both should consume at least 1 gram per pound of protein. Just for the endurance person, it's recovery. For the strength power person, maybe it's to gain lean mass, maybe it's improved body composition, but also recovery. And probably the primary difference between the two groups is one consumes more carbs. So that would be the endurance person. Why? Because they're expending a hell of a lot more energy. Now, when it comes to bodybuilding, and this is where bodybuilding is kind of this weird sport where it's how you look.
Yeah.
And oftentimes how you look, you see guys on stage and you're like, wow, they're really muscular. And then when you actually get next to them, it's like, wow, they're actually kind of small. And it's an illusion. I always say bodybuilding is about creating an illusion on stage where you want to look bigger than you actually are. But with bodybuilding, it's sort of like this. The goal is to gain lean mass and then sort of make yourself look pretty. I mean, it kind of simplifies it too much, but that's really what you're doing. So to gain lean mass, obviously you got to train, and there's multiple ways to gain lean mass. It could be high weights, lower volume. It could be high repetitions and high volume. So the nutrition side, how much protein should you eat? Well, it seems like, around 2.2 to 2.3 grams per kilo might be all you need. Do you need more than that? And again, for bodybuilding, because part of it is losing body fat, it may help to actually increase intake to help body composition, not necessarily increase lean mass, but to decrease fat mass. So people focus so much on increasing lean mass, but let's face it, again, bodybuilding the goal is to create an illusion that you're much bigger than you are. And part of that is losing fat mass.
Right. So you think that for a bodybuilder, maybe more so for the fat loss portion of the sport to improve body composition, that this higher protein intake is probably a pretty decent idea?
Yeah, and I think it is. And in a way, a lot of bodybuilders have adopted it. And I think the question is, what's the upper limit? Because obviously there's a cost to this. It's not like bodybuilders are rich and they can just buy as much protein as they want.
Right.
A lot of them get sponsored and they might get free protein, but there's a limit to it. But we don't know what that upper limit is. And I think, people play around with super high doses. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is you just oxidize the extra protein. But yeah, finding that upper limit would be interesting.
Yeah, I know, just kind of anecdotally, I had a really good bodybuilder on this podcast, and he was a coach as well. And he said something he does with it's Valentine Tambosi for any of the listeners that are curious about him. Mm-hmm. But he said with his clients, he kind of cranks his protein up to either like 2 to 3 grams per pound. So that's kind of up in that.
Whoa, that's high.
It's pretty high, yeah. So probably around that 4 grams per kilo mark for some of them at least. I'm not sure if he does that for everybody, and I don't want to totally like speak for him here, but he says that one interesting thing that he noticed. He says that overall he thinks that his clients do notice a difference when doing this in terms of recovery and performance and things like that. But he said that he notices that his clients tend to look fuller. So like their muscles, it seems like they almost look more filled out, which is a little counterintuitive to me because I would feel like that might be more of a glycogen thing with the carb source. So have you noticed anything like that in your studies or anything?
No, I haven't noticed that. And actually you're dead on, because if someone says they look fuller, the first thing I would think is, oh, they're glycogen loaded because you have extra water with glycogen, but not from eating more protein. So, but again, a lot of bodybuilding is illusion, because some people, they always say, hey, I wish I was in the kind of shape after the show when I ate some food and I looked fuller. And I'm like, well, then why don't people eat before the show so they look fuller? And no one ever does. I guess they're afraid of looking fat or smooth or whatever. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I can't see why protein would do that. I can't see that.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know, just spitballing here. The only thing would be if they increase protein a lot and they did see some of that fat loss effect, then it might create an illusion that they're looking a little bit bigger. Maybe I'm not sure though.
You know what? That's as good an explanation as anything else, because physiologically, it doesn't make sense that extra protein would make your muscles seem fuller. I mean, unless they're also sneaking in a donut here and there so that they're storing more glycogen.
Right. Yeah. And, some things just don't tend to make a lot of sense, but we see them like eating 800 more calories in some of your studies and not seeing increases in fat. Like that seems crazy.
No, it does seem crazy. And sort of an anecdote to that, we had many subjects when they come in for post-testing, they would mention how they were constantly hot. They would be constantly sweating, which of course is related to the thermic effect. Yeah. I had one subject, she said she would literally, to cool off, because we're in South Florida where it's hot anyways, but to cool off.
Rubbing it a little bit more there.
That's right. It's about 75 degrees outside, just so you know. Yeah. So you got to put sunscreen on even during this time of the year. But anyway, so she would lay in bed, she said, and basically lay there with no covers on and just turn the fan on, because she said she was constantly sweating and she felt hot, which explains in large part how you have a hard time getting fat on protein, because you're just oxidizing and burning the protein as fuel. So, but yeah, it's interesting how, different people respond differently. But that was one of the common themes that, people like, I'm hot and I'm sweaty all the time. I'm like, wow, okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. To me, that would seem to align really well with the theory that maybe your NEAT levels and your non-exercise activity is just kind of ramped up there quite a bit.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
And did you have any of your participants run into any more like gastrointestinal distress or anything like that when eating these higher protein diets?
It's a good question, but the quick answer to that is no. And the reason why is people who volunteer for these studies tend to already be consuming protein powder, and also wanting to consume more protein. It's, that's why when you look at studies that use untrained subjects, if I got untrained subjects and said, okay, you're going to consume 4.4 grams per kilo of protein, I guarantee you they'd have GI distress that first day. So that's why, I don't want to use untrained subjects, because they're just not going to fare well in these studies.
Right. Yeah. They're probably more so used to eating like 80 to 100 grams of protein a day instead of like 300 or 400. Right.
And that's their high protein day.
Yeah, exactly. That's a day where they did good,
Yeah. They're like, hey, I almost hit 100. Yeah. I'm like, yeah, you should do 100 more. You should weigh 200 pounds.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, before this episode, you kind of mentioned that you did a little bit new research on this FTO gene and how that kind of relates to body composition. Definitely sent me down a rabbit hole of looking through some studies on it. So if you could kind of explain what this gene is and what potential implications it might have, that would be great.
Yeah, this is actually some cool stuff. We're doing some collaborative work with the Department of Neuroscience here at Nova Southeastern University. this neuroscientist. Her name is Jamie Tarter. And this collaboration started because we did this initial study where we looked at a group of about 100 athletes and we genotyped them for the FTO gene. And I'll explain briefly what the FTO gene is. We all carry the gene. However, there are variants of the gene that will predispose you to obesity. Let's face it, you might be let's say you carry the normal gene and someone else carries the risky gene. You might be 1.3 to 1.7 times greater risk for being fat or obese. And so we looked at the gene on a group of about 100 athletes. And interestingly, and these are lean people, these aren't even fat people, but interestingly, the group that carried the risky gene actually had higher body fat levels than the normal group. And this is what's funny. It's like, so I looked at their body fat levels. You're basically saying one group was 18% fat and the other group was 15% fat. Mm-hmm. Visually, you can't tell. To most people, like, wow, they're in great shape. They work out. But when you actually measure body fat, it's like, wow, it's actually higher. So we thought, okay, what's the next step? Well, let's do a randomized controlled trial where we put people on a diet, and we've already tested about 32 people. So we put a group of people and we said, we want you to cut your calories by about 20%, 20 to 25%. And keep your protein intake high because we don't want you to lose lean mass. So they're keeping their protein intake at about 2.2 grams per kilo, give or take. Mm-hmm. So for 4 weeks, they're eating much less calories. So what do we find? Well, we find that, when you cut calories, you lose fat. Isn't that amazing? If you eat less.
Crazy.
Despite the fact that people on social media is like, oh my God, I'm not eating anything and I'm getting fatter. I'm like, how's that even possible? But anyway, so it's just funny. I can't lose weight even though I'm not eating. So then everyone's losing weight, but is there a difference in the amount of fat that's lost if you carry the risky gene versus the normal gene? And interestingly, actually, if you were to guess, would there be a difference? Just guess. It's a coin flip.
Man, so one of my guesses, my intuition would tell me that if you had the risky gene, the gene that might predispose you for obesity, that they would lose less. But they may also have a higher starting point of body fat, so they might have more to lose. So I'm gonna go with that they lost less, but I'm open to the idea that they lost more.
Actually, the way you've worked it out in your head is actually really good. So first thing we looked at is what's the starting level of body fat? Because you're like, well, if you have more fat, you have more fat to lose. There's no difference. So we found, the starting level was not different. It might be the sample size is a little small. It means only 32 subjects. Okay, they're sort of starting out at the same spot. Now they go on a diet for 4 weeks. What we found was there's no difference in fat loss between those who carry the risky gene and those who are normal. It's kind of interesting. Here's the explanation. Okay, so what this gene does is, let's say, and I actually have the risky gene, and I think that explains why at a buffet I can't stop eating. It affects satiety. So your brain doesn't register feeling satiated as well as someone who has the normal gene. So you eat, you're like, I'm not full. I'm going to keep eating. Whereas someone is like, you know what? My brain says I'm full. I'll stop eating. So in the short run, anybody can cut calories and lose fat. 4 weeks is easy for most people. It's like, yeah, I can do that for 4 weeks. But if someone said, could you do this for 4 years? I guarantee you those who carry the risky gene, they might be able to do it for a while. And then after a while, their brain is saying, you know what? I'm still not satisfied. I need to eat more. So over the long haul, you'll find that those who carry the risky gene can't regulate their appetite as well as those who don't. And that's why I always say, in the short run, you could overcome genes easily. In the long run, now it's difficult because now you're fighting your genetics.
Wow. So basically, this gene is more so like affects your levels of satiety and things like that, rather than like something going on with maybe your NEAT levels or your metabolism or something like that. It's more so your satiety.
In general, and without getting into too much of the biochemistry, there's actually different what are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Some that regulate the generation of brown fat. So this would be thermogenic. This particular one dealt with satiety. And in fact, the current study, we're actually looking at 3 different SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, looking at, you have satiety, you have brown fat, you have these other ones where predisposition to diabetes, They all are related to each other. So typically, if you have one, you have the other. So if you're at risk here, you also are at risk there. And I think this is where it's tricky. It's like, so why are people so easily obese? Well, they're fighting their genetics. That's one. But then there are people who have the gene, the risky gene, and they are actually quite lean. So is it something with willpower? I mean, I don't know. If you put yourself in a position where your lifestyle makes it so that you don't expose yourself to those foods that might make you want to overeat, that's another thing. I mean, let's face it. We all have free will to buy whatever we want at a grocery store and at a restaurant. No one is forcing us to buy anything. Yet a lot of people who are obese typically purchase calorically dense and not nutrient dense, but calorically dense foods because why? It's palatable and we like the taste. So I sort of the bottom line, and this is more for, we've actually looked at some other genes for like athletic performance, but in general, I mean, genes can definitely limit you, whether it's the FTO gene, and we've actually looked at also the speed gene, the actin N3 gene. It's the gene for speed. However, training and, your lifestyle can, to some extent, overcome that. I mean, I always say you're not a slave to your genes, but your genes sort of like want to point you in a certain direction. Excuse me. And you have to decide if you want to go down that direction or that path.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So you're not saying that it's 100% down to genes and that if someone has this gene that they're totally screwed then.
Exactly. Yeah. Because, it's always an interplay of genetics and environment. It's just a question of, here's the thing, worry about the things you can control. You can't control genetics, but you can control your environment. So control it as much as you can.
Yep, for sure. And that's something I remember when I was kind of coming up, I would be searching what is the genetic potential and stuff like that. And now I just realized like, dude, it's not worth worrying about because you can't change anything about it.
Yeah, you can't change it. So, and here's the thing. People, in a way, they intuitively know, or they have an intuitive sense of, if I have the risky gene, the FTO gene, based on how they eat. I mean, there are people I know people who are, they are perfect portion controllers. Literally, I've never seen them pig out, like ever. It's just like, wow, you eat and you're done and you don't really pig out on anything. Whereas me, I go to a buffet and I just want to keep eating and eating and eating. So there are people who like, you know what, food is great, but when I'm done, I'm done. I don't have to have like 2, 3, 4 servings or something, which I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm a little bit envious of those people because I'm similar to you to where I feel like my appetite is unlimited. It almost seems like.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Iowa has a lot of buffets.
Yes, they definitely do. Yep. Definitely known for our good food here in the Midwest, for sure.
In fact, if you, because I used to teach at the University of Nebraska in Kearney, and I was so surprised at how many buffets there are in Nebraska. I'm like, wow, every place is a buffet. Everyone just eats here. Everyone's big.
We have nothing else to do over here.
Hey, when it's cold in the winter, it's like you might as well eat, right? Stay warm.
Exactly. Get that thermic effect going,
That's right.
Yep. And do you think that for the FTO gene, do you think that people should practically like be testing themselves to see if they have this gene and try to make different changes based on that? Or do you think that it has those implications?
I always say it's always good to have information about yourself. So let's say you test for it and you don't have it. You don't have the risky allele. You don't have the risky gene. Then you say to yourself, okay, then why am I overeating? So at least you have that information. The flip side is you find out you have it. Now you might be at higher risk. So how am I gonna change my environment so that I don't increase the risk anymore? And I'm a big fan. Hey, the more information, the better, because then you can make an informed decision.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I could kind of see it both ways to where maybe you don't want people to see it because then they could use it as an excuse all the time and then they just kind of rationalize it with themselves. But then again, I feel like most people that are going to be educating themselves on something like this would be intelligent enough to kind of use it as just information to help them rather than something that, like as an excuse or something like that.
Yeah, to me, whether, if you genotype yourself, to me, it's information just like, if you want to know your body composition, if you want to know if your training program and eating program actually promotes a gain in lean mass and fat mass or loss of fat mass, measure it.
Yeah.
People are like, oh, I don't want it on the number. I'll just look in the mirror. I'm like, yeah, but the mirror can be a little deceptive. So let's measure it. Let's see what happens, because now you have numbers and now you're truly assessing. I mean, you've probably heard the saying, if you're not assessing, you're guessing. So you don't want to leave this to guesswork. We have the tools to measure these things. You might as well utilize these tools.
Yep. Yeah. It's difficult to manage what you can't measure, for sure. For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So where can people find more about your work, more about this stuff online and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think I do want to mention the ISSN conference, International Society Sports Conference, a sports nutrition conference. It's in Las Vegas this year, June 13th and 15th. I'll be there, of course. I help organize the conference. But a lot of my work is published. You could either do a Google Scholar search or a PubMed search with my name, and you could cross-reference it with protein or exercise, and it's pretty easy to find my work. Also, I post a lot of stuff on social media so that people can see it on both Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. So, but I'm easy to find. I'm at Nova Southeastern University in sunny, warm Florida. For all you
sunny,
islands
warm
there.
Florida.
Yeah, and there's all these Canadians down here. You know that? It's like Canada
Really?
invades Florida in the winter. Yeah, it's really kind of weird. It's like all these license plates, Ontario, Quebec. I'm like, I thought they loved Canada, just not in the winter, apparently. So yeah, and people can reach out to me on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, and I try to answer all questions. But really, the best place to find great sports nutrition science information is at the ISSN conference, and it's in Las Vegas again in the middle of June. And the website is issn.net. That's issn.net.
Cool. And I can totally attest to ISSN because you guys do some really great position stands on various topics, give some nice, really good practical takeaways. And I think doing great work with that for sure.
Yeah, in fact, we we're actually this year, we're going to have several position stands coming out. We're going to have a new one on caffeine. We're going to have one on ketogenic diets. We're going to have one on probiotics. And there's a few others, but those are the three of the main ones. So we recently finished, did one on protein, on nutrient timing, on creatine. So yeah, if anyone is looking for great sports nutrition science, our journal, it's jissn.com. It's open access journals. These publications are free. You don't have to pay for them. I mean, that's a great place to go.
Yep, totally. I think that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Dr. Antonio.
Hey, thank you. And hey, stay warm in Iowa.
I'll do my best.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of The School of Muscle. Make sure to go check me out at ryanjsalmon.com. If you're interested in coaching, make sure to go check out Dr. Jose Antonio, and I will see you in that next one.